6:45 in Trinidad and Tobago. Good to have you with us as we continue on this Thursday morning. Let's deal with the issue now of prison environment and prison reform. Activists Dr. Wayne Kublalsingh and Nazma Mullah are among those continuing with their advocacy for the rights of prisoners, which they say they are being kept in inhumane and unsanitary conditions. That was essentially confirmed by a study which was chaired by Dr. Ramesh Diosaran, Professor Ramesh Diosaran, several years ago. Well, last October, Ms. Mullah wrote to the Commissioner of Prisons and the Minister of National Security to meet on the matter. When that failed, she and Dr. Kublalsingh embarked on various demonstrations to highlight their cause, and they've continued to do so even over the holiday period. We're joined now by Ms. Mullah, founder of the Caribbean Center for Human Rights, and we're well aware of her advocacy as well for the decriminalization of marijuana in Trinidad and Tobago, and where that is right now, which is another discussion as well. We also have with us Dr. Randy Seepersad, head of the Criminology Department at the University of the West Indies. Good morning to you both. Thanks very much for joining us. If I can start with you, Nazma, who's of course well known in the media environment, former media colleague as well. Are you making any headway? Are you getting any recognition or even a response to this level of advocacy as to the situation in the prisons, especially those on remand? What is the situation as far as getting some sort of action?
Well, we haven't gotten any action as yet. We have received a response from the Attorney General, Faris Al-Rawi. He has delegated someone to meet with us and to hear our concerns. We haven't had that virtual meeting as yet. We met with the DPP. He assured us that he would look at many cases, about 500, that we felt could be reviewed. Many of the inmates, of course, they put forward that, the evidence is not there. There are reasons that they should be released, and we've asked the DPP to review those cases, and he assured us that he would. We haven't received a response as yet, and we hear rumors that he's going on leave. In terms of actions, no, we have not seen a return of visits. We have not heard that airing is better. We have not heard that conditions have improved, so we continue to advocate.
All right, let me get a perspective from Dr. Seepersad before we get back to you, Nazma, about the broader issues, because there are a number of layers of discussion that we could have this morning, as far as whether we're talking about those who are actually convicted, those who are on remand, and so many areas in between. But Dr. Seepersad, head of the Criminology Department at the University of the West Indies, very good of you to join us in our discussion this morning. What perspective do you bring to this dialogue?
First, good morning, and thank you for having me on the show. Let me say that prison reform is something that really is a whole of the justice sector type of approach that is needed, right? You can't expect prison reform to just be about the prisons. If there isn't governmental will, if there isn't will in the Ministry of National Security, there isn't even will in terms of the court system to rationalize the way that prisons are used, then we would have a lot of difficulty in having prison reform. Let me say also that what might be perceived as a lack of prison reform is not necessarily as a result of a lack of will to reform within the prison system. The upper management of the prison system is well aware of some of the issues. They are very much interested in reform and in improving the prison system. They have some very progressive ideas. Part of the thing that really keeps them back is governmental will to get things done. I'll give you just an example. Nazma had mentioned some issues in the prison system recently, and I'm aware, for example, that one of the initiatives that the prison system took during the COVID period, which still continues, is that they submitted a list of persons, reviewed the cases, submitted a list of persons who might qualify for remission, that is, for early release from imprisonment, submitted it to government, and nothing ever came of it. So it's not that there isn't the lack of will, but as long as, from a system perspective, as long as we continue to simply see the prisons as a dumping ground for people that we don't want, there will be no need for reform, because all it is considered to be is a secure environment where you dump people, and once that happens and you can keep them secure and away from the public, there are many people who perceive that the function of the prison is served, and that is absolutely not so, because the function of the prison goes far beyond just a dumping ground for people.
And if I could bring Nazma Mullah back into the discussion, hence the reason for the public activism on this, but aren't you basically throwing, well, what should I say, throwing China against a concrete wall? Because essentially you don't get the sense from the general public that this is an issue that they are willing to put pressure on the government. If we go by the argument of Dr. Seepersad, that those at the helm of the criminal justice system and the prisons environment are keen to bring about these changes, but are stymied by the logjam and the indifference at central government level, you don't get the sense, Nazma Mullah, that from the general public that there's any real hue and cry.
Well, hold on. I believe the general public does not understand that the reason we have so much crime is because the criminal justice system does not work. If a crime occurs, if you have a burglary, a robbery, a rape, the police are not in a position to deal with your matter because they're still dealing with matters from 15 years ago. Men who are still on remand, waiting for a trial. So, for instance, in my obscene language matter, which has been going on since October 2019, yes, the police has to keep coming. The officer who arrested me has to keep coming to court, right? So nothing gets done, everything gets adjourned. That's why crime is escalating like that, because perpetrators feel they will not get caught, they will not be prosecuted.
So therefore, the question that I want to ask you, Nazma Mullah, is, I mean, what do you want to see done? Because if it is that you are told, okay, we'll have a meeting, okay, we'll find out what it is you want, and all that sort of thing. Everybody knows what we want. Everybody knows what the society wants. This has been brought up by Professor Antoine Bell at UWI as a human rights issue. We've had, as I mentioned, Professor Diosaran's report. We've had a high court judge walk into prisons and say 2 years ago, this is an intolerable situation. Yet 2 years later, it is still there. So the point is, Nazma Mullah, we all know what the realities are, yet there doesn't seem to be any desire to bring about any change. So what can really be done?
I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not sure whether Nazma was supposed to respond.
Yeah. I'm asking Nazma, as far as from the activism point of view, what needs to be done given all of these realities?
Well, we are using different techniques, different strategies. We are using the media. I have made contact with the IDB. And they are asking me at what level, at the government level, because there are international agencies that can put pressure on the government. That is where we're at now. We are looking at the IDB and other stakeholders, the international human rights community. These are the people we are going to bring in, because Trinidad and Tobago is part of a global society. And we have signed up to certain treaties that say we acknowledge, our government acknowledges that we are human beings and we have rights, and there are best practices, because what is happening in the prisons, what is happening in the criminal justice system is affecting every single citizen of this country in many ways, indirectly and directly. So we are taking this thing to another level now. We are dealing with the IDB, we are dealing with people who have the ear of the government.
And before we go to a break, and we'll continue the discussion after the news, could I put it to you, Dr. Seepersad, that given the way politicians tend to operate, this could be spun around in the same way of the issue of the Venezuelans coming into Trinidad and Tobago as some way to try to embarrass. Could it not have a negative effect as far as public perception if it is that you bring in regional or international agencies to try and embarrass Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, it's an interesting question you raise, and Nazma was talking about putting pressure on government, and really it is quite unfortunate that we have to reach that kind of point. And what the international agencies really try to do is that they try instead to work with government rather than put pressure on government. And Nazma mentioned the IDB. Nazma would be aware that over the last 2 years, the IDB was in fact doing a very intensive study of prisons in the Caribbean. And that followed up from a study, the same study that was done in about 7 Latin American countries. So Trinidad and Tobago was one of the countries, and there is a very in-depth diagnosis of the Trinidad and Tobago prison system and all of the problems in the system, which the IDB sponsored. And in this case, I happen to be the project director for that particular study. And so the government has all of the recommendations. And what is quite interesting as well, we talk about public education, public pressure. Certainly we know that the public needs to be educated, but it is not that the public in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere in the Caribbean is necessarily as unaware as we think they might be. Over and over, I've seen surveys conducted trying to get public opinions on reform within the criminal justice system. And what you would see over and over is that the public is actually very, very progressive. And for some reason, quite unknown to me, despite the findings over and over that the public has very creative ideas about what to do about the crime system. They're very progressive in terms of their thinking. The politicians seem to be moved by this idea that the public just wants a punitive type of approach, meaning longer sentences, higher fines.
Dr. Seepersad, I have to interrupt you because we have to go to the news, but I'll answer your question. I will give you the answer as to why that continues to prevail when we come back after the break. We'll continue our dialogue as well with the good Dr. Seepersad and Nazma Mullah on this whole issue of the prison environment and reform and so on. But here we have, as we go to the news, a submission from Heidi of Maraval. It's a video of a feline stray at the old police station headquarters trying to find shelter in the wheel well of this vehicle during the rain. And yes, we're still having some rain in the early days of January in 2021. Now for an image from Nazim Yamin of the moon taken on the 28th of last month at his home in Diamond Village. Interesting one. Looks like almost somebody shining a torchlight through a slat in the door or in the window. It's an interesting one. But we go to the news and then return to our dialogue with our two guests.
Vibrating on a high energy. Yeah, we come into your life with a bag of good vibes. Everything is alright.
Coming up towards 5 minutes after 7 o'clock in Trinidad and Tobago. Good to have you with us as we return to our dialogue with Dr. Randy Seepersad, head of the Criminology Department at the University of the West Indies, and Nazma Mullah, founder of the Caribbean Collective for Justice, highlighting the issue of prisons reform and the environment in the prisons, which have been described by many different agencies and personalities as inhumane. And just quickly to answer the question for Dr. Seepersad, who wondered why is it that even though the public would appear to show progressive ideas as far as prison reform, you're not seeing that from the politicians, is because the progressiveness of the electorate is not reflected at the polls. That politicians don't pay a price for their backward attitudes as far as prisons and prisons reform and so on. So that is basically the short answer to that. So let's move along. Nazma Mullah, if you could return to the situation. You were behind bars not so long ago, so you have a personal experience of the environment in the prisons, and indeed the concerns about, we think about being a predominantly male environment, the prisons, but what about the woman? What about the situation and the impact on families when we talk about people languishing in the prison system?
Well, as a woman, I feel that we need to have a more gendered perspective, and we're dealing with inmates, especially in remand. Most of the women on cell block with me in quarantine, I didn't get to go into the general population. I got bailed just before I was going to be transferred into the general population to share a cell with someone. But most of the women had children. And one woman, Melissa Thomas, has 8 children. What happens to those 8 children when these women are imprisoned? There is no effort to ensure that the relationship that they have with their children is maintained through phone calls. So the women then have to commit what is considered illegal acts in obtaining phones through prison officers. So you are causing them to commit more crimes inside the prison to do something that is a human right, which is to keep in contact with your family. So
And
this,
but,
and also
but
the use of pails, the use of buckets to defecate and urinate as a woman. And you were talking about maintaining health in a COVID crisis. There was no bleach, there was no disinfectant for us. So these are simple, basic things that the prisons can fix almost immediately. The airing. Why are we locked down for 23 hours, 24 hours on the weekend? What is the purpose of that? I have not been convicted of anything as yet, and neither were these women.
And the issue would be, Nazma Mullah, that yes, they were not convicted as yet, and some will say, well, look, you know, the entire issue of the length of time people spend on remand remains a major concern. But to your question as to whether or not the women's human rights are being violated by their inability to contact their children, the cynical and maybe callous response will be, well, if you didn't commit any crime or haven't allegedly committed a crime, you wouldn't be there in the first place.
Well, this is why we have trials and why we have legal aid to prove. And it is, remember, we are innocent until proven guilty. And that is why you have trials, so that the evidence can be brought forward. And this can happen to anyone. A neighbor, a relative can set you up, the police can set you up, and you end up in prison and you can't come out because the bail is set very high, the bail conditions, your bail has to have a clean deed. In my case, I was at least given a cash alternative. Some people, they just get the surety bail, the approval, and they have to get a clean deed. So all of these things, they point to a policy of punitive and aggressive acts against citizens, which are against best practice, because in developed societies, which we all aspire to be, these things don't happen because first and foremost, the government, the state recognizes I am a citizen of this country and I'm a part of this society and I have contributed and I can continue to contribute.
Yet,
there are ways to deal with restorative justice where the victims and the perpetrators come together and they can actually talk about compensation or different avenues to give redress to the victim other than incarceration.
Yet, Dr. Seepersad, we have a situation where, as a former Prime Minister, Patrick Manning, famously said many years ago, jail ain't nice. And that seems to be the common denominator of national thinking, notwithstanding your assertion that there seems to be an element of progressive thinking, that the idea is that the horrors of the prison environment is supposed to be a deterrent, and indeed that whole concept of imprisonment is viewed as punishment. Your perspective?
Well, the thing is that what we need to recognize is that being imprisoned is the punishment. Prisoners are not sent to prison for punishment. They are sent there as punishment. So it's not that you send them there and then the environment has to be horrible and deplorable and disgusting. That's not the case, right? There are prisons in some countries much more progressive than ours, in which the environments are very clean, they're very good, there's low levels of violence. And you find that in environments like that, people come out with a much lower likelihood of recidivating. That is, they come out and they're much less likely to go back into criminal offending. And as long as we fail to recognize that the prisons can be as much a part of the problem as a part of the solution, then we will not make any progress. And what do I mean by that? I mean that prisons can literally function as universities for crime. Nazma rightly said that families are at risk. It's not just the persons who come into the prison. On the side of the person who comes into prison, you could develop values and attitudes conducive to offending. You could develop a hatred for society. You lose your job. There is no proper reintegration services almost anywhere in the Caribbean. When you come out, there is a high likelihood that you will end up in prison. On the side of those on the outside, like the families, they are also at risk because they've lost a breadwinner. The children are at risk of joining gangs. They're at risk of engaging in delinquency and all of that because there is a lower level of supervision. So when you don't recognize that prisons could have all of these negative consequences, and you use it as a dumping ground for just any and everybody for every offense, then you run into big problems because you're creating a situation where you're breeding criminogenic people. You're forcing people along that road. And Nazma spoke about something very, very important when she said that there are alternatives. Prison should be an absolute last resort. Restorative justice, mediation, community sanctions, home monitoring, electronic monitoring, all of these things. There are so many options that we can use. And what I will tell you, we have done it. Let me tell you, we have done it in the child justice system. Not too long ago, we did not have a juvenile justice system. Now we have an entire overhauled system with the help of the UNDP and other international organizations. We could do it with the adult justice system as well if there is the will to get it done.
And that is the issue, Nazma Mullah. In the little time that we have available, the activism that you and Dr. Kublal Singh and others are engaged in, are you sensing that there is any effort? Because at this point, there seems to be no desire by this administration and the one before it, and indeed the one before that one as well, to engage in the reform that seems to be the sensible thing to do, simply because there is not that political pressure to do so. So what do you do next? Nazma?
Yes, we turn up the pressure. We turn up the fire. We turn up the fire. We turn up the pressure. We keep it on. It happened with the ganja, and let me tell you, it is going to happen with this criminal justice reform, because what we are tapping into is the collective consciousness of the society, and the people will act.
Well, someone was just saying, and I was thinking about it myself, you sound like a soca star about turning up the pressure and turning up the fire, because essentially that amounts to nothing if the wider population doesn't see it as an election issue.
Well, I mean, the thing is, we are fighting an entrenched oligarchy. Party politics is deeply embedded in every aspect of our society. And really and truly, this activism is to wake up the people to the fact that they have the power. Every decision is our decision, because we live with the after effects of the decisions taken by the politicians. And I am heartened that every Friday, this Friday, tomorrow will be our 13th Friday out. The people continue to come, the women with the staying power, the mothers, the wives, the girlfriends, they come out, and we are forced to be reckoned with. Mr. Archie, we coming to see you again soon. We will be outside the Red House. Something has to give.
And in the couple of minutes that we have available, Dr. Seepersad, what final perspective would you like to leave with us in our discussion on this one? Because this is an ongoing thing. We've been having this discussion for decades. Maybe it's ramped up a bit more with this level of activism and so on. But what is your hope that as far as seeing real and meaningful change take place?
Well, I would say that now really is an opportune time. The international aid agencies and support agencies are ready. In fact, I mentioned that the Inter-American Development Bank did a very, very extensive study, and they're very practice oriented. It's not that they want to see all of this good work just sit and collect dust. So from the perspective of an academic, the expertise is there, the universities are there with the expertise and the ideas, and the international agencies and scholars are there to support the process. I can't speak too much to the political side of it. There really seems to be very little political will to do anything about the prisons, because we've known about the problems. You mentioned Ramesh Devsaran's report, which was so many years ago. In 2013 that came out, and nothing has been done. And as it turned out, there were the riots at the remand section, and the remand section was almost destroyed, and the prisoners transferred to MSP. So that's how it turned out. When that building really, I've visited the remand section many times. It's unfit for humans to live. I sometimes compare it to, honestly, to a rat hole. Of course, I've never been in a rat hole, but I imagine that's probably what it looks like. So I would say there is the technical expertise and the international aid ready to move forward with this.
Dr. Seepersad and Nazma Mullah, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. And as Nazma Mullah mentioned, the activism will continue on Friday as it has every Friday. And you know what would help as well to wake up the politicians? Let them have a cabinet meeting in remand yard, and let them use the buckets to defecate and urinate and so on. That might help. That might help. Condemn them to a sitting of parliament or a cabinet meeting inside remand. That might be useful. And as we go to the break, now for a couple of submissions from Lenora of Piparo. The first is an orchid, and the other a rooster on the fence. And let's see the rooster on the fence. Is he sitting on the fence? Okay, PNM, UNC, you can't make up your mind. So you're sitting on the fence. PDP, PNM, you can't make up your mind if you happen to be in Tobago. So thanks very much for sitting on the fence. And now for a submission of The Morning Sun by Christine in Maloney Gardens. Do we have that image up that we're going to put up for you? There you go, the Morning Sun from Maloney Gardens. And remember, our internal selectors are the ones who are going to be kept busy this morning as we go to the next break.